In this video, I want to talk about one of the most important and yet oftentimes misunderstood ideas in JavaScript, and that is going to be promises. A lot of people find these confusing, but honestly, I think they can be pretty simple if you understand them in the right way. What exactly is a promise? Well, a promise is simply an object that is going to have one of three states. So we can write this here. We can say possible states are going to be pending, and then we can also have a fulfilled or rejected state. So we can say fulfilled or rejected. So what does this mean? It means that in a pending state, we don't know what's going to happen, right? Think about like a coin flip. We know we're going to flip the coin, but we don't know if it's heads or tails. And fulfilled means we know what happened. It was either heads or tails. And rejected means something went wrong, right? We don't know what happened. And these are useful in a lot of different circumstances, but one of the most common is going to be network requests, right? Say we send some request off to some server to get some information. That's going to be pending while we wait. And then when it gives us that information back, it becomes fulfilled. But if something goes wrong in that process, which oftentimes can happen, it's going to be rejected, and we need to handle this rejection, meaning we need to handle this error case. Okay, so how do you create a promise? Well, there's a few different ways, but the most basic is using the promise constructor. So let's say const promise is going to be equal to a new promise. Now, the promise constructor is going to take in a function, and this function is going to have two parameters, resolve and reject. Of course, we can call these whatever we want, but typically we use resolve and reject, or sometimes you'll see res for resolve and rej for reject. And that is how we create a promise. And we can come down here and say console.log out our promise, run this code, and you can see we have a promise with a state of pending. But then we can use these two functions to resolve and reject the promise. So resolve means to fulfill it. So these are sort of terms we use interchangeably, and reject, of course, means to reject it. So we could come over here and say resolve, and then we pass in whatever value we want to resolve to, say the value of 10. Now, if I run this, you'll see we have a promise with a value of 10. We could put any value here. So this could be a string like hello world. And now we would have a promise with a value of the string of hello world. Additionally, we can reject the promise. So we could say reject, and typically we reject with a new error, but we could also just have some other value here, such as this string. And you'll see we have this promise rejected hello world. And then we also get an error message because we have an unhandled error. We did not catch the error from the rejected promise. And we will see how to handle this unhandled promise rejection in a moment. But for now, let's go back to our resolved promise with hello world. Now, what's important about these promises is they allow us to have this pending state, and we're oftentimes using them with these values that we don't know what they're going to be just yet. And to sort of simulate this, one way we can do this is using a set timeout. So I'm going to say set timeout, and what we're going to do is say in the timeout, we want to resolve to a value of 10. But let's do this after 1 second. So now we log out a pending promise. And the reason being, this is non-blocking code. So we don't wait for the resolve to happen before moving on. So what this means is that when we log out the promise, the second hasn't passed and the promise is still pending. However, if we did something like this, say a set timeout here, and then inside of this set timeout, log out the promise, and let's say do this after 2 seconds, you'll see after 2 seconds, we're going to get the promise with the value of 10 because it has had enough time to actually resolve. We could also log this out twice. So we could do something like console.log our promise, run this, and you'll see we get the pending promise. And then after 2 seconds, we'll get the promise with the value of 10. Okay, but this doesn't really feel great. We have these timeouts and we're just sort of hard coding values, but we don't know always when exactly our promises are going to settle, meaning when are they going to change states from pending to either fulfilled or rejected. For example, with the network request, we don't know when that request is actually going to come back. So we can't just use a set timeout like this. So instead of this, what we can do is use some functions on the promise, because remember, promises are just objects. We created them with this constructor function. So we could say promise dot then, and dot then is going to take in a function. So this is going to get the value from the promise, and we can do whatever we want with it. So for example, we could say console.log out our value. And now what this is saying is take this promise, and whenever it finally resolves, then run this function that's going to log out the value. So now if I run this, you'll see after 1 second, we are going to get this value of 10. Now, one other note here that doesn't really directly have anything to do with promises, but I do think it's interesting, is that .then right now is taking in a callback function, and this function takes in a value, and it passes that value to console.log of the value. So this is actually essentially equivalent to just saying .then console.log, and this is going to work the same way because remember, console.log is itself a function, so we don't need this whole sort of wrapper of passing the value into it. But okay, now what do we do if the promise actually rejects? So if we said reject and we had some error, so say new error, something went wrong. If we run this, we're going to see this error shows up in our output because we didn't do anything with the error. We didn't catch that error. And there's a few ways we can do this, but one option is that .then could actually take in a second parameter. So we could add a second parameter, and this is going to get in that error. We could do something like console.log, oh no, and then let's concatenate the error message. So we can say plus error, run this, and you'll see now we get oh no, and then error something went wrong. And this is going to be that whole error object. So if we wanted, we could do error.message, and now we would get, oh no, and then just something went wrong without that error semicolon piece. Now, this does work, but oftentimes this is actually not the syntax that most people prefer. So what I'm going to do is take this whole function and I'm going to cut it from here. And what most people actually prefer is instead to do .catch after the .then and then pass in this same function. And this is going to do essentially the exact same thing. So .catch works like .then, but it just takes in a single function and it works like that second function that we could pass in to .then. So it's going to actually catch whatever errors we have and it's going to allow you to do something with them. But how does this even work? So we have .then, which is a function of the promise, but what is .catch? It is a function of whatever .then returned. Well, it turns out that .then actually returns a promise. So because this returns a promise, we can actually use other functions of the promise on that promise. We could also chain multiple .thens. So let me show you what this looks like. So let's go like this. What we could do is say promise.then, and let's take the value and let's say value times 2. So we're going to take our value and multiply it by 2. And let's change this back to resolve and 10. So what's going to happen is in 1 second, we resolve to 10 and then we get into the .thens. And the first one takes a value and it multiplies the value by 2. So this means that this returns 20. And then it's going to be a promise because .then returns a promise with whatever value was returned in here. So because of that, we have a promise with 20 and that promise with 20 is already going to be fulfilled. So then we get into this function, this .then, and it's going to console.log out that value. So if we run this, you will see that we actually log out 20. And we could do this as many times as we want. So we could do .then value, and we could do something like value plus 5. So now what we're doing is multiplying by 2, which is 20, and then adding 5, so we will get 25. But now if we did reject here instead, and let's put some error again, let's say new error, and I'll just put error message like this, run this, you'll see we get the oh no and then the error message. So this promise, the first promise, rejected. So what happened is we got into this first .then, so we had a rejected promise and we called .then and it has no second function. So all it does is it just returns the rejected promise we already have and it goes down to this one. And this one again does nothing with it because it has no second function. So we return that rejected promise. Same thing here, we do nothing. So we have a rejected promise and then we get to the catch, which actually uses that rejected promise. Now, catch also returns a promise. So what we could do here is let's actually open this up on a new line and go like this. And what we could do is say in the catch, return 100. And now what we could do is say below the catch .then, and let's just do console.log. And now if I run this, you will see we get oh no and the error message, and then we get 100 because the catch returned another promise and that promise had a value of 100. And then this .then logged out that value. Now, a few things to note here. One, this isn't a great example because we wouldn't really need all these .thens for this. This is doing a lot of extra work that we don't need. Of course, we don't need to create all these promises just to multiply the value by 2 and 5. We also very rarely would return from a catch and then do something with that value again. It can happen, but it's not a pattern that's super useful. But The point here is to understand the pattern of taking a promise and being able to chain .then and .catch after it, and the fact that these are just going to keep returning new promises. Now, it's worth noting here that there is also one final function we could use here, and that is going to be .finally. And this, again, takes in a function. This one is not going to have any parameters, and we can do whatever we want here. So, for example, we could say console.log done, and if I run this, you will see we get done at the end, and this is going to happen regardless of if this promise rejected or resolved. So if we said resolve and let's do a value of 2, run this, you'll see we end up logging out 9 here, and then we actually log out undefined here because console.log returned undefined to us. So this value is now undefined, but then we log out done down here. And again, this undefined is because of the fact that we had this .then that is doing a console log, and that has no return value. If instead we did value and then say something like this, and we did console.log the value, and then actually return the value, now you'll see we get 9 a second time down here. But then regardless of what happens, we always are going to get into this finally block. Okay, so now a few other things I wanted to show with promises. So let's remove all of that. And first of all, it's the fact that we can create a promise that's actually not pending. So what I could do is I could say const promise is going to be equal to promise.resolve and say 10. And then we could do console.log out our promise. And if we run this, you'll see we get a promise with 10. So promise.resolve, you'll notice we don't use the new keyword here. We just call this function and it gives us a resolved promise. And that promise, of course, is fulfilled. We could do reject as well, and this is going to give us a rejected promise. So you can see we have a promise that was rejected with the value of 10. Now on this promise object, we also have a few other pretty useful functions. The first is going to be promise.all. What promise.all does is it takes in an array of promises. So let's say promise.resolve, and let's say 10, and then we'll do, oops, we need a comma there, promise.resolve, and let's say 100 here. And now what we can do is, let's save this value. Let's say const all is going to be equal to that. Let's say console.log out all. And what you'll see we get is this pending promise. But if we were to come over here and we did all.then and then console.log, so we wait for this to resolve, what we're going to get is an array with those values. So essentially what this is going to do is it's going to wait for all of these promises that we pass in to be resolved, and then it's going to return an array of their values. And now again, remember promise.all returns a promise and it's taking in promises. So what we can do is we can give it promises that are not immediately going to resolve, and it's going to actually wait for them. So for example, instead of this one here, what we could do is say new promise, and let's pass in a function with resolve and reject. And what I'm going to say is set timeout, and inside of set timeout, we will resolve to the value of 10, but we're not going to do it for 1 second. And now what's going to happen is when I run this, it's going to take a second before promise.all actually hauls .then. And when it does, we will have those values of 10 and 100. Now, what is important here is if one of the promises rejects, so let's say promise.reject, we are going to immediately reject. So this is not going to wait for this promise. It is simply going to reject the second it finds one of these promises are rejected. Now, if you don't want this, you can change it to all settled. And this is going to wait for all of the promises to settle, meaning switch from pending to fulfilled or rejected, regardless of if they are fulfilled or rejected. So even if they reject, it's still going to wait for all of them. So you can see if we run this, we get these objects with the status of fulfilled and rejected, and the value for 10, and the reason was 100. So that's what we actually rejected with, which typically would be an error value, but we have 100 here. Now we also have another function here that's going to be race, and race does not care if they fulfill or reject. What it cares about is which one settles first, meaning which one actually resolves or rejects first. And in this case, we have promise.reject 100 happens effectively immediately. And then we have this one that takes 1 second. So what we're going to actually get is the rejected value. So we have this unhandled promise rejection again. But if this was resolve, and we run this, you'll see we get 100, and it doesn't even care about this one. Even if we rejected this, you'll see it doesn't matter because of the fact that race is just going to return the first one, and the first one was 100, which was this resolved promise. However, sometimes what you want is you want the first resolved promise. You want to ignore the ones that have errors and just get the first one that resolves, so the first one that actually becomes fulfilled. And for that, we can use any. So for example, here, let's say we reject this one and we resolve this one, but it takes a second. So even though it takes a second, it's going to actually wait for this one because this one rejected. Now, of course, if we reject everything, then there's no results here. And this is actually going to throw an error. So you can see we have trigger uncaught exception. And it's worth noting here that this is not this error. So we don't actually see this value of 10 anywhere. What it's doing is it's simply throwing an error that, hey, you called promise.any, but every single promise that you passed into this array actually rejected. Now, this promise object does have a few other functions that are a little bit newer, so we don't see them used a ton yet. And what I'm going to paste in here is some code that is a pretty common sort of pattern that we used to see a lot with promises. And that was creating a new promise and having resolve and reject, but needing those resolve and reject functions outside of this scope. And the way to do that was simply to create these global variables and to put these values in those global variables. However, there is now a new way to do this. So what we can do is we could say const, and we will have our promise, we will have our resolve, and we will have our reject. And we are going to destructure these from a call to promise.withResolvers. And this is going to show some errors because we have the same variable names. But if we get rid of that, you'll see we now have this promise from promise.withResolvers. So we have the promise, resolve, and reject. If we come down here and we say console.log our promise, you'll see it is a pending promise. If we did something like resolve to 10 and then do console.log of the promise again, we now have a promise with a value of 10. Now, it's worth noting that this doesn't have amazing support across browsers just yet, but depending on when you're watching this, it might be more or less usable. And this isn't something you'll want to use a ton, but if you ever do find yourself needing the resolve and reject functions at a larger scope than inside of the promise callback, then you can do it with the resolvers. And I think it's just a bit cleaner syntax. But now, thinking of cleaner syntax, we saw that big dot then and catch chain, but that's actually not the only way to handle promises. It is the original way, but there's a new way that you've possibly seen before, and that's going to be with async and await. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And we don't need this either, but we can leave our new promise here. And let's say our promise is going to resolve in a set timeout. So after, say, 500 milliseconds, we will resolve to say 100. And we saw before that we could do something like promise.then and then do something with it. So we could do something like console.log. And this, again, works. But now there is another way to do this, and that's going to be using async and await. So these are two keywords that are used connectedly a lot. So async allows us to create asynchronous functions. So what I mean by that is we can say async, and then we can just define a function like we normally would. So let's say function and give it some name. So let's say log promise. And now this function works just like any other function. So I could say in here, console.log, and let's just log out number 5, just to show you that I can say log promise. I can just call this like a function and it logs out 5. So it works just like any other function. But what does async actually do? Well, async says this function is asynchronous, therefore it should return a promise. So if we were to come down here and we said const result equals log promise, and we call this, and then we console.log our result, what you'll see is we log out 5 because that's what happens in the function. And then our result is this promise with the value of undefined because we returned nothing. But if, say, we return 1000, you'll see we have a promise of 1000. So essentially this just creates a promise with whatever value you return. But okay, how does this relate to our original promise and .then? Well, what we can do is we can come back into log promise. What we can do is use the await keyword. So what we can say is say await, and we will await our promise. And this is going to be a value. So we could save this value. So let's say const result is equal to await of our promise. And then we could do console.log our result. And now let's call log promise again. So let's say log promise, call this, and you'll see it's going to log out 100. So it's waiting for this 500 milliseconds. So this code actually waits. And then once result is a resolved promise, then we are going to actually log it out. And now you might be saying, okay, but why do we even need async here? We can just do this, right? We don't need this because we're not using the fact that this is now implicitly returning a promise. However, this is actually something we do need. So if I remove that, you'll see we get this is underlined and says await expressions are only allowed within async functions. So if we run this, you'll see we get that same error, syntax error. Await is only valid in async functions and at the top level bodies of modules. So inside of asynchronous functions or inside of the top level of a module is the only time that we can use the await keyword. We cannot use it in a standard function. Okay, but now what if this function rejects? So if we do reject and let's do a new error and we'll just say hello world and we run this, you'll see we have this error from where we rejected, but we don't have like the equivalent of catch. So how do we catch the error? Well, there's a few things we could do. One option is log promise does return a promise. So we could say .catch and maybe we take the error and do console.log and we could do oh no plus the error .message. Run this and you'll see we get oh no hello world. So log promise, because this threw an error is going to throw an error. We never end up getting to console log result. And since this errored out, the promise is rejected and we get into this catch. However, I don't personally love this because we're sort of combining the then chain methods of .catch with async and await. I don't think that's the best way to do things. So what I'm going to do is remove that. And instead what we can do is use try catch. So we can say try, and inside of our try block, we could run this code. And then if we catch an error, so we can say catch our error, then what we're going to do is do that console log again. So we can say console log, oh no, plus our error, and you'll see this is going to work the same way. So oh no, and then we have the error, or we could do error.message if we want, and we'll have oh no, and then hello world. But of course, if we go back to resolving here and say 100, you'll see we get 100 because in the try block, we don't throw an error. And that's essentially all there really is to promises. I know it can seem sort of confusing because it's a lot of syntax. You might have not used this syntax very much before, but if you just think about them in this core idea of all a promise is an object with one of three states, pending, fulfilled, or rejected. And when that state changes, potentially we might want to do something. So when that state goes from pending to fulfilled, we might want to say do something with that value it fulfilled to, or when it rejects, we might want to catch that error and do something with that. When you think about it in this way, it's pretty simple from a sort of conceptual perspective. And then it just comes down to remembering the syntax of either using async and await or using that .then and catch chain. Now, of course, promises are something that gets used a lot in JavaScript, but if you want to see some features that I don't see many people actually using, you should watch this video next.